Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Nature's Happy Hour, and the last in this series of Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation. I'm Chris Gambie, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. On a quiet Saturday afternoon when I was 14, I sat, as teenagers do, in my room with headphones on, entranced by a new CD that I'd just bought from my local brashers. I remember the smell of the printing of the cover booklet and the lyrics printed inside, and the click of the disc as I placed it in my very high-tech Discman. The album was Blue Sky Mining, and my world was about to change. I lingered on every word and every song on that album. It helped me discover the world around me. It lit a fire in me and made me realise that I did, in fact, want to change the world. The balance sheet is breaking up the sky. That album was recorded in 1989. I hope that's right, Peter. Speaking of things that were made in 1989, Jackie Mumford, how do we sleep while our beds are burning?
You're really showing your age now, Chris. And I think our guests will have plenty more to say on that. And they do need very little introduction. Tonight we're joined by Tanya Plibersek, who's the Shadow Minister for Education and has previously been the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party. And Peter Garrett, as we all know, was the front man of Midnight Oil, or you might know him as the former Federal Environment Minister.
Now, before we speak to Tanya and Peter, Jackie, hit us with those round rules again.
Yeah, my pleasure. So tonight we have over 1,300 people who've RSVP'd. It's great to have you all here and welcome. If you're new to NCC, make sure you head along to our website, nature.org.au, and sign up to keep up to date with what we're working on and what's happening for nature in New South Wales. And if you are new to cocktails, the ground rules are very easy. Put any questions that you have in the chat and we'll try to get to them tonight to ask Tanya and Peter. Grab yourself a drink, and if you can afford it, please head along and donate on the nature.org.au website.
And as we always say, koalas grow on trees, but money doesn't. So if you can chip us a few bucks to keep this going, that would be absolutely fantastic. Tanya and Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tanya, it seems that everyone in politics has a book about themselves these days, although I think it might be said that some people have got pretty slim books, more like pamphlets than books. What inspired you to compile this collection of essays and turn them into a book?
Well, first of all, Chris, before I answer that, I just want to thank you and Jackie and the Nature Conservation Council for hosting us this evening and pay my respects to the elders of the land that I'm on tonight, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in the Canberra region. What inspired me, I think the amazing thing about the COVID-19 period was actually how many things we achieved that just seemed impossible before. So housing rough sleepers, moving almost overnight to remote learning, rent relief, wage subsidies, doubling unemployment benefits. Like there's all these really quite incredible things that we managed to do. And for the most part, Australians were disciplined and they were kind and they looked after their neighbours and they were prepared to follow the advice of scientists, follow the evidence and look after each other. And I found that phenomenally inspiring, but it also raised the question in me, if we've managed to achieve so much during this period, what more can we do? All these things that we keep being told are impossible plainly are within our reach. And so I asked some of the smartest people I know and the most decent people I know, people like Peter Garrett, to imagine how after COVID-19 we could have a better future. So not snapping back as the government would have it to the old problems that we had before, but taking what we'd learned about ourselves into the next stage of social and economic development for this country. And that was the inspiration for the book. And I'm actually just really proud of it because there's some fantastic ideas in the book from brilliant people. And also all the proceeds go to 2 homelessness services, which I thought was a good thing to do at a time like this too.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tanya. You mentioned some things there, around things that we previously would have not thought possible, that we're, now seeing come to fruition. And Peter, just last week in New South Wales, the Energy Minister managed to get a roadmap for weaning New South Wales off fossil fuels through Parliament. How do you reckon we get that kind of action at a federal level?
Well, it's one of the most important questions, not only for this discussion, and I know Tanya and her colleagues are focused on that as well, but for the rest of the nation, because without that national leadership, even though some of the states are asserting themselves and we're seeing some positive steps, we're not going to go as quickly or in as integrated way as we need to do to transform the energy sector and to get ourselves down onto zero emissions, particularly through a much greater uptake of renewables. And I think that, look, it's the kind of work that the NCC does. It's the kind of work that happens in politics. But for me, it's also about expanding out in a really strong and clear way to Australians a sense that we're being ultimately let down in a really fundamental way by the leadership of the Morrison government, because the recalcitrance, the laggardliness, the disinterest, the fudging on the edges, etc., that we see, and unfortunately we've become used to over time, is so deplorable and so difficult to accept as a citizen who is concerned about the future, that I think nothing short of whole-scale community action, outrage across all sectors, and significant political action as well will be necessary to remedy.
Yeah, that's I reckon that's spot on. Peter, we've just been involved in a new alliance in the Hunter Valley between unions and environments groups called the Hunter Jobs Alliance. So led by the AMW, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, who of course have got members right through the Hunter, unions like the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union, have been involved, environment groups ourselves, the Lock the Gate, Lean, of course, the Labour Environment Activist Network, have set up this thing called the Hunter Jobs Alliance. And the idea is to support economic development in that region as we shift to the clean economy. What do you, just reading your chapter, what do you make of this sort of binary choice that some people are trying to create, that that we've got to choose between jobs and climate action?
Look, it's always been a false choice, Chris, to the extent that it's important for politics to take into account people's livelihoods and the fact that people need to be able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, have a roof over their head at all. So it's something in the past which sometimes can appear to be waved away by a little bit of a magic wand. And yet all of the history of the last 20 to 25 years, probably longer, points out that the economic and employment gains from making sure not only that we protect the environment, that we conserve our natural ecosystems and places of beauty, but now that we essentially transform our energy and economic system to one which doesn't produce carbon, and we start to sort of slow down the rate of increase of heating and thinking about what we're going to do about heat that's trapped in the system, it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually a net positive for employment and livelihoods. And it's an argument that just needs to be prosecuted more fully. It's one which is understood increasingly by economists, by the corporate sector, and certainly by other countries, not only in our region, but most particularly the EU. And yet here we've been held back, as it were, by a cabal of interests, really, who've perverted the debate in the country, who have far too much sway on the Conservative side of politics in the House. I mean, if Mr. Keane, as Environment Minister in New South Wales, can produce these kinds of reforms, why can't Susan Ley and Angus Taylor? And yet, as soon as I utter particularly that last name, we all realise it's a joke and it's not going to happen. So I just think that the debate has always been far too constrained. It is a false binary. You're absolutely right. And the sooner that we're able to prosecute the arguments that show pretty clearly that we're going to see more employment, not less, if we get on this path, the better.
That's, I mean, that bill that passed through the Parliament last week that that Keane managed to get through, I mean, in some ways is pretty extraordinary in the sense that he had everybody, and the only people he didn't have on side was Mark Latham and the shooters, farmers and fishers. I mean, they tried to hold up the Parliament for 2 days before they passed it, but to get that sort of level of broad consensus, and I mean, even within the coalition, to get that level of broad consensus, business community, the union movement, this variety of interests of people that are getting behind this bill that is pretty radical in some ways in terms of the transformation that it promises for the economy. That must give you hope.
Well, it does, but I mean, I've got a slightly different perspective probably, because for those people who are working, and I'd be interested in Tanya's views, but for those people who are working in the field, and for many people who are watching this Zoom, they would be people who are interested and focused and have probably worried and thought about this issue and are active about it for some time. My own, and I think that's fantastic, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing the Zoom, is we want NCC and the other organisations to be out there and to be healthy and to be well supported. But really, what Keen has put forward and what is happening is only the beginning of the change. I mean, follow the money, really, apart from coal and fossil fuel money, follow the money otherwise. And the economic changes that are being wrought in terms of understanding the need to respond to the climate crisis and to get ourselves on that zero emissions path are unfolding at an extremely rapid rate. Now, there are, the big issue really here for Australia is that we've always had this idea, and we've been able to, I mean, the conservative forces in particular in politics have been able to sort of raise the spectre of carbon taxes, and we've had debates about taxes, and climate policy's been vexed in Canberra, as both Tanya and I, and when I was there previously, know, even though we did have in place effectively a scheme which reduced emissions over time. It just didn't last that long, tragically. Yet, the point I'm about to make is that not only are the arguments in favour of producing us as a renewable energy superpower, which I put in the chapter in Tanya's book, very clear cut, and I think very hard to counter, but even more important, other than the climate risks that we face, the risks of the Great Barrier Reef and so on and so forth that many people know, we're going to face the economic risks of multilateral arrangements that basically seek to penalise you if you're not prepared to do the right thing by the planet. And that's what Prime Minister Morrison is in great risk of exposing Australians to, that we will actually have carbon taxes, as it were, on the borders. So I see the elephant in the room, the failure of the Australian government and conservative politics at the national level to be able to provide the leadership that we need, and those consequences, the impacts that we're likely to face nationally on the national environment and the national economy, very, very great.
Yeah, that's right. Tanya, what are your thoughts on that sort of choice between jobs versus environment, or jobs versus climate action?
Well, it's always been a nonsense. It's always been a nonsense. Even if you didn't care at all about the environment, I know that's not the case with the people who are participating tonight, but even if you didn't care at all about the environment, renewable energy is now cheaper than coal or gas. So from absolutely purely economic terms, it makes no sense to turn our back on the capacity that renewables have to bring down energy prices for businesses. Like, you've got a government that talks about, the cost of electricity as an input into businesses. We've worked out 2.5 million Australian households have got solar panels on the roof because they've worked out it's cheaper. We've got, study after study, report after report showing the plunging prices of cleaner energy compared with old forms of energy. And it's just an absolute nonsense for a government that says that they're worried about jobs to turn their backs on that. And Peter's quite right about this issue of carbon tariffs on the border of one type or another as well. And Joe Biden's just been elected in the United States and has made very clear that one of the things that the US will be seeking to do is make sure that other countries abide by the carbon pollution reduction targets that they've set, and that they don't try and game the system by, for example, doing what our government's proposing to do, use carryovers from previous rounds to meet their current targets. And I think, Peter's talked a little bit about the opportunity of jobs. There's cheaper energy, cheaper, cleaner energy that supports manufacturing and so on. There's the jobs that come in constructing new generation and transmission and firming facilities. And those jobs are everywhere, right across our community. But there's also the jobs that can come from carbon farming initiatives, from energy efficiency initiatives. So there's just a whole range of things that we can be doing that provide jobs that are good for the environment, that are good for climate change, that are also good for the economy, for people who are working in our economy in every part of our country.
Yeah. And you mentioned there, Tanya, that Joe Biden's just been elected in the US on a platform of action on climate change. Could you just go a little deeper there on what you think the implications of that will be for climate politics in Australia and internationally?
Yeah, I think it's really clear from the early statements that Biden himself has made and that his transition team is making, that this will be a really important part of their foreign policy. And at the moment, Australia's on the wrong side of that. We are unambitious as it is. We're seeking to be less ambitious over time as other countries ramp up their ambition. We've now got more than 70 countries around the world that have got a zero net emissions by 2050 target. China, one of the biggest polluters and the one that our government always points to as the elephant in the room, has got a zero net emissions target by 2060. Our major trading partners, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, we're looking for a free trade agreement with the UK. The UK government's made it clear that they want to see ambition from Australia when it comes to pollution reduction targets. This will become, as Peter's pointed out, a feature of our international trade negotiations. And so there's the potential of being punished, but there's also the enormous positive potential here. Like Ross Garnaut's chapter in the book is a sort of shortened version of the thesis he lays out in Superpower. We have this fantastic capacity, as Christina Figueres was saying today. We've got so much solar, so much wind. We've got the capacity in Australia to be a world leader in green hydrogen, to power highly polluting industries like steel manufacturing, aluminium manufacturing, cement, all of these things that at the moment have very high carbon pollution emissions. We've got the opportunity of minerals processing is the other one that Ross Garnaut points to, of being exporters of these products if they are produced with cleaner energy. And you've got countries around the world looking to try and reduce their carbon footprints, wanting to buy these products. Why wouldn't we be? Why wouldn't we be making use of this natural advantage that we have? Instead, we've got people here in Canberra who want to turn their backs on that natural advantage. Every state and territory, Liberal, Labor, doesn't matter. They've all signed up to zero net emissions by 2050, and yet our federal government can't do it.
Yeah, and we've mentioned renewable energy a lot tonight, and I'm just looking at some of the comments coming through in the chat there, and I know that the NCC supporters are really also concerned about deforestation.
Yes.
Wondering, Peter, and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts, Tanya, as well. What role you see around stopping deforestation as a form of action on climate change?
Well, look, I think it's a very important issue, and I understand why people are coming in on it. I think there's a couple of things to say quickly because I know we haven't got much time. The first thing to say is that if you properly price carbon in the system, in your economic system, then you're not going to be chopping down trees and taking out old growth forests willy-nilly because they're great carbon storage. The second thing to say is that the reforms that are being planned by the Commonwealth Government in relation to environment laws are highly deficient because they essentially end up devolving a great deal of approval powers back to the states. And in some states in particular, the capacity for unabated land clearing to continue at a scale which is really, really terrible if you look at our species extinction rates and the like, that's going to continue unless and it doesn't look like that those changes to the laws will go through yet, but that's basically the direction that the current Commonwealth Government, it is cocktail hour, isn't it, would have us consider. The final thing, though, is that whilst at the same time we're seeing essentially either the development of or land clearing continue unabated, broad-scale land clearing, we also have the countervailing capacity of many Australians who are actually reforesting. And so whilst our tree cover and the exposure that native animal and plant species have is pretty much in the spotlight, and particularly after the big fires of last year and early this year, obviously terrible damage to native species in particular. We do have, I think, an underlying sentiment in the country that we don't want to see land clearing take place at that rate. And again, coming back to where we were on the question of the climate crisis, it's just about leadership and setting those national standards and making sure that we basically look after the place better. Yeah,
I think, I mean, particularly here in New South Wales, where land clearing laws got relaxed a few years ago, Matt Keane is doing a good job, I think, in the energy portfolio. But a lot of the gains that we're making in terms of emissions reductions are being kind of swallowed up by the losses that we're making when it comes to just the sort of industrial scale clearing of land.
I think one of the other things that's been really interesting about this year is that people who aren't as alive to issues of land clearing and native forests and so on as perhaps the people on this Zoom might be, have really needed in nature, in green environments, as a sort of contrast to being locked up in the house on their own. And I don't know whether I'm being naive, but I'm hopeful that that's something that stays with people for a while, actually placing some value on open space and nature.
Yeah, certainly, NCC is the peak body for New South Wales, and so we've got a lot of member groups with a lot of different interests. And one of the things the National Parks Association will tell you, or one of our big member groups, is that there's a new challenge, which is
managing all the people who want to love the national parks.
Yeah, which is a good problem to have, right? But it does take resources and it does take care. I know in my local park, I was bumping into people that I know had not been in that park for 20 years. Tanya, I guess one of the questions that everybody wants to know, and I guess this is that I've got some personal experience with this, of course, is that ultimately this becomes a political question. Do you think that a political party in Australia can win an election with a strong climate platform?
Yeah, absolutely, I do, and I think it's absolutely critical to for us as a Labor Party to lay out an ambitious policy. I think in an environment where every state and territory has set a target of zero net emissions by 2050, like I said, the rest of the world's heading that way. Where 2.5 million Australian households have worked out that putting solar panels on the roof is a good idea. Where, every summer we go through the sort of catastrophes that we've seen in recent years. I think it's absolutely vital for us to do it. I think the biggest jobs killer in this area is the uncertainty that we've had on climate and energy policy. So we've got a government that's had 22 different energy policies. And when I talk to ordinary people from the person stopping me on a street stall to the head of our largest banks, our largest mining companies, our largest shopping conglomerates, basically everybody has accepted that we need to act to increase the amount of clean, cheap energy that we've got and protect our environment. The only people who don't seem to agree is the government, and they ran a pretty good scare campaign against us last time. But I just don't think that people are going to be sucked in election after election to these scare campaigns that we're going to steal their utes off them and destroy the weekend and all the other nonsense that we heard last time round. Yeah.
Peter, what do you've won more elections than I did. What do you reckon?
Well, we went to the 2000 and 4, but even the 2007 election, which Labor won, that 2007 election was a climate election, and the policies were pretty robust for their time, as I know, having been part of the group that formulated them. And we won the election, and clearly. And since then, leaving aside all the toing and froing of politics and the arrival of Abbott and so on and so forth, which will give us all the shivers, really, to be honest, at this time of the day, public opinion generally has become more and more supportive of resolute climate action by political parties. There is an issue for Labor, and it's an issue that I'm as aware of as anybody else, and that is seeking to balance what is seen to be the interests of working Australians as against the kind of transformations that are needed. And that is one where I think we do need, and I really welcome Tanya's comments, continuing strong leadership. There's another component to this, which we haven't discussed yet, but we have a lot of heat in the system. And we may think that it's possible for us to try and hold temperature increase to around 1.5 to 2 degrees on current trajectories and prediction rates. I very much regret to say that's unlikely to happen, even if we were to see consensus arise out of the next negotiations in Glasgow around the Paris protocols, etc. And it seems to me that what we're saying at the moment is very necessary and very important, but there's an additional step that has to be taken, and that is we have to realise that we really do need to put ourselves essentially on that emergency footing, which some scientists and others are calling for, to recognise the scale of the challenge and the opportunities that lie within. And I must say that I see very few signs of that at the national political level, from my own party much more so, but certainly not from the Conservatives, to reconfigure not only the way that the economy works, but the way that we organise ourselves generally, so that we're actually maximising every step of the way and making it a national and an international sort of, emergency task, as it were, to hold back the heat that's in the system. The costs of the climate crisis are already great, and the longer that we delay really getting stuck into it, the greater the costs increase. And for Australians, it's an interesting thing, because we've got this absolutely beautiful country and all these opportunities that Tanya was talking about. We've got and I know many people will be pointing out the things that aren't there, and I'm only too aware of them myself. But generally speaking, as we were with COVID, we're well placed to take not only a strong and constructive role here in the country, but also a leadership role more generally. And yet we're going to be left behind if we don't get on board that. And I see the young activism around the school strikes for climate. I see the sort of rhetoric that we're starting to see come from the courts. It's not rhetoric, really, they're decisions. I see what was mentioned earlier briefly by Tanya and yourselves around economic and finance, particularly the super funds, and citizens' action and shareholder citizen activism and the like. I mean, here's a question, and I won't be the only lawyer on this Zoom link up. When you go to first year law school and you first do criminal law, the whole question around criminal law is around foreseeable harm, and the fact that really negligence and culpability arise from the fact that someone can actually see if they fail to do something, someone else is going to suffer the consequences, is going to be hurt, it's going to be damaged. And it's beyond me, and I've written about this before and talked about it, and I mean, it's past my time, but I'm sure there are young lawyers, hopefully, that will do it, as to why we are not holding people to account legally for the damage that is already being done by their failure to act. So I think this debate is going to open up, it's going to transform itself in bigger and more profound ways. We keep on coming back to the question of national leadership. That will be absolutely crucial, but so will citizen activism. And citizen activism can push that leadership, as it's done in the past in this country. And of course, then we can take big steps and bold steps.
Some huge issues you've covered there, Peter. Thank you for that. I think, absolutely right. And Tanya mentioned that, a political party in Australia, could get elected on an election platform of climate change, and you mentioned that being your experience. People in the chat are also mentioning some really significant site battles, the Narrabri gas project. Dr. Anne Paulina in Western Australia is there talking about fracking in the Kimberley. Just would love to hear your thoughts on, we've also talked about hope and inspiration and all those kind of things. What should the climate movement be doing right now? Is it about those site battles, or is it about creating the sort of the political window? What do you both think the climate movement should be focused on right now?
Look, I'll make this pretty quick and then hand over to Tanya. I'm happy to expand on my comments. I mean, I served 2 terms as the president of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and have got a great deal of respect for conservation organisations and the movement generally. I consider it one of my natural homes. I've got a couple, but it's certainly one of them. I think national environment organisations need to work more closely together, and where they can agree, combine resources, combine focus, absolutely, on the ground. Get that community support, do the organising that's necessary, and win those campaigns, win the hearts and minds of people, and increase the numbers of people who are involved. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, I think, is to describe the vision of what Australia looks like when it does take care of the environment, when it really does start to reduce emissions and gets on this zero path. And that's why Tanya's book's good, because you've got stuff in there, particularly Ross Garnaut, but others as well, talking about what Australia can look like when we have this as a priority. The final thing is, I think, is to make sure that in the discussion and the engagement about what we want and what we as a community would like to see happen in the short-term future, to recognise that we have to take people who don't necessarily agree with us along with us where we can. And I mean, this opens up that whole question of what we've just seen in the United States, where you've essentially had a form of partisanship that is so extreme that it prevents the country from going forward. We have to be really alert to the dangers that lie there, and make sure that we try and really consult with, engage with, talk to, and hopefully enlighten at the same time our fellow Australians on that path.
Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I think we could probably have kept talking for another hour, but unbelievably, we're now out of time. For everybody who's asking, the book is called Upturn, A Better Normal After COVID-19. I imagine, Tanya, it can be bought at all good bookshops, and we should boycott the ones that aren't stocking it. And we'll post a link to everybody in our follow-up email about where you can get that book online.
Post it in the chat.
You can buy it on Booktopia, which is an Australian online bookseller. So go for rather than the big international one.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. And before we go tonight, Chris, I think there's one more thing we have to do. I've heard there's a birthday happening today.
Oh.
Really?
Yeah.
Happy birthday to you.
Oh, thank you.
Happy birthday, Tanya.
How cool is it that I get Peter Garrett singing happy birthday to me? Is it like the best thing ever in my life?
It only barely balances out the torture of having to be in Parliament House right now, I suspect.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. And Jackie and Chris, thank you so much for hosting us this evening. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. And Pete, it's so good of you to do this, and so good of you to write the chapter in the book, and it's lovely to see you.
Hey, likewise. All the best.
Thank you.
For joining us, and thanks to all our audience who's with us tonight. Thanks so much for being with us, and for everyone who's joined us throughout the year. And especially thank you to all our presenters, to Peter and Tanya tonight, but to everyone who's joined us for cocktails this year.
This is, of course, the final episode for this season of Cocktails. It's about to be Christmas and the summer break. But just a few weeks ago, Jackie and I travelled through outback New South Wales along the Darling River, and we've packaged up a couple of Cocktails episodes to tide you over during the summer break.
Yeah. So we talked to some people in the Pilliga about the Narrabri coal seam gas mine, communities along the Darling-Backer River about the struggles along the river and the Menindee Lakes.
And we're going to definitely keep this going for next year, so please keep an eye out for the program for next year. And please do tell your friends. All of the episodes, people often ask if they can see a recording of the episodes. They are all up on our website, which is nature.org.au, and the cocktails part is just /cocktails. And you can also go to the Nature New South Wales Facebook page. And here's some breaking news. Very soon, all of our Cocktails episodes are going to be up as podcasts as well. Because everybody's got a podcast, everybody's got a book, and now everybody's got a podcast.
We need to jump on that bandwagon. And as you well know, we don't get government funding here at NCC to advocate for the action that we take on climate change or protecting koalas. So if you can spare a few dollars, we can keep doing the work that we do. So at the end of the call, you'll be redirected to our donations page. And if you can, please chuck in what you can so we can keep doing this work.
We really know that the money is tight for everybody at the moment, but COVID has hit the environment movement pretty hard as well, including organisations like us. So every dollar that you can give does make a huge difference to help us keep fighting these fights. And I think it really importantly also keeps us independent. Tanya, Peter, thank you so much. And good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
See you all. Bye.
Yeah.